Australia Institute's very first election night live stream. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. We can't wait for the next couple of hours. It's going to be very exciting. I'm joining you, or we're all joining you tonight from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and to the traditional owners of the land. Thanks so much for joining us here on election night. The polls close in about 30 minutes, and tonight you'll get some information on the key seats, how the vote is going, how the campaign went. Hopefully we'll hear from a couple of special guests as well. For those who don't know, my name's Ebony Bennett. I'm the Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and tonight I'm joined by our Executive Director, Richard Dennis.
Hey,
and also on the panel is our Chief Political Analyst, Amy Remeikis. G'day, Amy.
Hello.
And Amy will be dipping in and out tonight because she's posting double duty also on the live blog. And if you're interested in the live blog and doing the double screen thing like most of us this evening, or even triple screen, head on over.
I can see 5.
That's right. Head on over to australiainstitute.org.au to find the live blog where Amy will keep you up to date with all the very latest information. So, Richard, I want to kick off. It feels like it's been a short campaign and a boring one. What's your overall assessment?
Oh, it's it. I don't know if this felt short. It feels long to me, to be honest. But I think what's really changed about Australian elections, and something I'm not a fan of, is because so many people are so proud now to vote early, to get it out of the way, to cross us off their list, that we're not having that sustained pressure. We're not having that sustained attention on the candidates and on the policies. And to be clear, we've seen in this election how important that is. I mean, what the Liberals thought was a good idea at the beginning of the campaign and what the Liberals thought was a good idea at the end of the campaign shows that election campaigns really matter. And the same thing happened in the Queensland state election. We can talk about that later. But yeah, when people are kind of get trained by the AEC and others, just vote early and get it out of the way, it makes the day go more smoothly, we're actually giving up a lot.
Yeah, and it is something like close to 7 million people, I think, who are expected to vote early this election. It's a very substantial chunk. Amy, I know you have been blogging this election on the live blog.
Every day.
Every day. I've seen all the ins and outs. Big picture, what's your take-homes from this campaign?
I think it's probably been the most uninspiring modern election campaign that I've ever covered, or that I can remember. I think that in terms of the major party offerings, it's who is the least worst. And I think that has been reflected by how voters have felt about this campaign in general. I mean, we've had small target, we've had just policy that's essentially just tinkering around the edges of what we already have. We have both political parties, both major political parties, essentially saying, we'll give you more of the same, but maybe marginally better. And I think that's one of the things that people have really struggled with this election, because every single time there became an issue about housing or tax reform or superannuation or inequality, or, in these last few days, even The Voice or First Nations representation, it was very quickly dampened down by both political parties. And I think that is obviously by design, but it does mean that, there are going to be some very major questions for the next government to answer, and I'm not sure if they've quite got those answers ready.
Yeah, got to that point of thinking that far ahead to the next parliament. But Richard, thinking about that, and overall it has been a very boring and kind of uninspiring campaign. On the one hand, looking at, I guess, the excitement of a Trump-style election campaign, boring seems preferable.
I'll take boring.
But where's the ambition here?
Well, look, to be clear, there's nothing in Australian political history or our constitution that says people seeking office should be ambitious. All right? It's quite clear that Labor think the best way to form government is to not be ambitious. It's quite clear that the Liberals think the best way to form government is to not be ambitious. It's also quite clear that the support for those two major parties has been falling steadily over the last 20 years. So I think what we've got is we've kind of built up a culture in Australia, a political culture, a media culture that just goes to these two parties to say, tell us what our options are. And they've clearly decided to have a nice tidy fight about a nice tidy box of issues that are fight worthy.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Like I'm a Democrat. I support their right to put up a boring agenda. I support the right of other people to vote for that boring agenda. That's fine. But
I don't.
Well, but the consequence of those choices are that no one thinks either major party is knocking it out of the park. And if Labor wins a majority government, it won't be because a majority of Australians voted for them. Like, no one thinks Labor will get a vote that starts with 4, let alone 5. So even that term, majority government, it's kind of hardwired into us to think in terms of there's only really 2 choices, and which of the 2 choices won? I'll respect the result, that's not my point. But the longer the major parties keep ignoring the major issues, the longer the major parties say, we're just here to fight about industrial relations and tax a little bit and everything else is a distraction, then millions of voters who care about domestic violence and care about Indigenous reconciliation and care about climate change and care about inequality, guess what? They're voting somewhere else.
Yeah.
So I think we need to be careful to be respectful of the results, whatever they are, but we're still allowed to interpret what that rapidly declining primary vote for both major parties means.
Yeah, and if we look at the last news poll, or the final news poll before the vote tonight, had Labor on 52.5, two-party preferred, to the Coalition's 47.5. But as you say, if you look at that primary vote, Labor's down to 33. The Coalition was at 34, which is a record low for them. So it is a growing majority over many elections now of people really moving away from the major parties. So before the votes start coming in, let's go through what some of the options are, I guess, for what the results are tonight. Obviously, Labor majority is one, a minority or hung parliament is another. What are basically the options that we might see tonight?
Well, you left out the Liberal majority government.
I did, that's so true.
Not that long ago, people were talking about.
Yeah.
Now, sorry to brag, but I put a bet on in March on Labor winning this election at $2.62 in March.
If you got on in January, it might have even
No,
been
it
higher.
kind of blew out.
Yeah.
I was on in January. I think I got about $2.30. March peaked at $2.62. Well, peaked for me, that's when I put that last bet on. My point is, not that long ago, people were still talking about Peter Dutton winning tonight. And there were people talking, even at the beginning of this campaign, maybe he could eke out a majority government. Now, I didn't think that was going to happen. Amy didn't think that was going to happen. Most people I knew didn't want to think it was going to happen. But it is an option. Who knows? We could all be surprised. But yeah, I think what's more likely to see tonight is what I think is most likely to see tonight is Anthony Albanese giving a "We Won" speech and Peter Dutton giving a concession speech. Whether we know tonight whether it's a minority or a majority Labor government, I don't know. I'm interested in that. But I think what we all need to understand is that even though news poll might tell us the two-party preferred and Anthony Green might lose his mind when the computer's not working, because preferences, because independent.
Yeah.
So talking about the major parties, talking about the two-party preferred, watching Anthony Green think there's something anti-democratic about someone who's not the major parties winning, all of those things have trained a lot of people to be quite scared of so-called hung parliaments.
Yeah.
But, if you live in New South Wales tonight, I don't know how you're coping. I don't know if you even know, but you're in minority government. And here in the People's Republic of the ACT, we've been in minority government for, 15, 20 years. So it's not unusual, but for the political class, for the press gallery, it feels like this enormous thing. But, frankly, tonight, even if Labor gets a majority in the House tonight, which is possible, Labor won't be able to make a law unless they can get a majority in the Senate, which they have no chance of getting tonight. So we obsess about the lower house, the House of Representatives. According to the Constitution, both houses need a majority to pass a law. So one thing I can tell you on the first day of Parliament, whoever the Prime Minister is going to be in minority in the Senate, and they're going to be negotiating with crossbenchers, independents and minor parties.
And Amy, when it comes to, I guess, the seat-by-seat analysis, we've got a lot more three-cornered contests, we've got a lot more independents contesting. Labor at the last election had quite a high watermark in Western Australia, for example. This time around, Victoria's perhaps not going as great as they would have liked. Are there any seats or races that have stood out to you, or you think are some of the ones to watch this evening?
I think it's really interesting because before the election campaign started, there were obviously seats that were firming up to watch, you know, like Bradfield and Aston, the new WA seat of Bullwinkle, Cowper, Wannon, they were already firming up. I don't think anyone really predicted just how catastrophic the Coalition's campaign actually would be. I think that there is an idea of assumed competence within our major political parties where we just sort of go, well, they've obviously got a very big campaign machine behind them. They're obviously going to come out of their blocks. Yeah, they're obviously going to be competent. And I think that by week 2, when not only had they proven not to be competent or even have policy offerings, the very small amount of policy offerings they did have, they were starting to either completely scrap, like work from home, or they were just completely confused on, like the public service policy. I mean, do any of us have any idea what that actual policy is and where those cuts are coming from?
I'm not quite sure where they landed in the end.
I don't think they're sure where they landed. And that changed, I think, a lot of seats because then suddenly you had Leichhardt in Queensland in play. You had Bonner in Queensland in play. We already know that the Greens are going to have a tough night ahead of them winning those 3 seats that they hold in southeast Queensland. But then you've got Wills in Victoria that's going to, you know, potentially go the Greens' way. Macnamara has been a hard fight for them. Richmond has been a hard fight. For Labor, they're having to fight in Tasmania, which I'm not sure that they were expecting to do, probably because salmon farming isn't popular with Tasmanians. Who would have thought it?
Or salmon.
Or salmon.
What's left of the salmon?
Or the poor Morgian skate. So not overly popular there. So they've had to actually spend more resources there than they were anticipating. Victoria is an absolute shit show for Labor that may have been addressed in the last couple of weeks of this campaign, mostly because Peter Dutton appeared to be an even bigger shit show, which seemed to have turned people.
Can you just unpack that a little bit more for people who aren't in Victoria? Why was that so problematic for Labor and what's shifted that dynamic there?
So the Jacinda Allen government is not a popular government at the moment. It's a tired government. There's been a lot of media about the budget position, and you can read some of Dave Richardson's work on why that's not actually a problem. But there's been a turn against Labor in Victoria, which is not just the polls, it's also the vibe.
Yep.
And that has shifted things for Labor because it was always the state they could basically take for granted. I think, was it John Howard who called it the Massachusetts of Australia? So Labor's never really had to think about Victoria, and suddenly they had to think about Victoria. And that meant that you've got seats like McEwen, which is, you know, potentially a bit of a problem for them. Bruce, at the beginning of the campaign, was an issue for them, as well as some of those inner city seats and a couple more on the outer ring. But then Peter Duttoned and started talking about how, crime was a huge problem in Victoria, that Victorians were essentially afraid to leave their houses again, which
is something he said in the past as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
It's failed in the past.
Yeah.
Why not try again?
He brought it up right before the last state election when African gangs were stopping people from going to restaurants. And then amazingly, after the state election, which the Liberals lost, was never mentioned again. We never had it heard about African gangs after that. So this was part of their crime focus, which has been quite successful in Queensland, but you cannot import successful strategies in Queensland to Victoria. You can import Victorians to Queensland. That happens all the time. But bringing what works in Queensland, particularly in the outer suburban seats, and applying that to Victoria does not work. And that was a misstep that Peter Dutton, a Queenslander, made that may have actually helped to shore up some of those seats in Victoria for Labor. It also helps that Labor's dirt unit is way better than the Coalition's dirt unit, and essentially they just saw who was being pre-selected, saw that there was not a lot of due diligence being done over quite a few of their candidates, and then the moment that nominations closed and those candidates were stuck on the ballot, all of a sudden we started seeing a lot of stories about those candidates, which also have basically helped shore up Labor votes.
Yeah, Richard, I also want to talk about, it felt like to me towards the end of last year, everything was going the coalition's way, and the kind of move towards that Trump-style politics essentially felt a bit like the wind beneath the coalition's wings. But this year, after Trump got in and started implementing his policies, the tariffs and those kinds of things, also how awfully he treated Zelensky and all of those kinds of things, it really seemed like the winds shifted, and then Trump more or less became a bit more of an albatross around the neck of the coalition, being so closely associated. Do you get that sense that also was a bit of a turning point?
I absolutely do. I agree with everything Amy said, particularly about that kind of Queensland-Victoria nexus. And yeah, I think rather than wind beneath their wings, Trump is more bats in the belfry. I think, before Trump won, he was a radical change agent, and he was promising to fix things, and the conservative press in Australia were like, yeah, that's ambition. Remember all that ambition we were saying? Well, Trump's got ambition. This is important. Whereas it didn't take long for Trump's ambitions to actually look bad for America and terrible for Australia. And all that talk last year of a Trump bump, all that talk last year of, progressive governments were going to lose all around the world because of inflation.
Yeah, like it was pretty bad for incumbents all around the world.
It was, which is why you should bet early, bet responsibly, everybody. Because, all of that, was incredible momentum for Dutton. What I think's most interesting about Peter Dutton is how good he was at being opposition leader from The Voice until about a month ago.
Yep.
And that's a job, being opposition leader. He did that job really well. What he didn't do was pivot to being someone campaigning to be Prime Minister. And I don't think Peter Dutton's stupid, and I don't think he's lazy. But there was a strategic laziness in their campaign, because they just kept doing the things that they've done for the last 18 months. Like, why change it if it's working?
Yeah.
But the things that you show up in Parliament to do to put pressure on the government of the day, which he did very successfully, are not the same as the things you need to do to convince swinging voters, hey, come to me. So I think history will probably judge that Dutton didn't run a good campaign. We're all pretty confident of it tonight.
I am history and I am judging it.
I'm so cautious, don't predict what you don't know. But I think Dutton will have a bad night tonight. And I think strategically, yes, the issues he chose to campaign on were wrong. They didn't really suit the times. They did nothing to try and win back the Teals. There's a long list. But I think the real mistake they made was Dutton just saying, look, I know how to do this, I've got this. Like, for 18 months, I've put pressure on Albo, I know how to do that. I'll pick the stories I want to talk about, I'll say the things I want to say, I'll leave good grabs for the news, and I'll vacate the terrain. And as I said at the beginning, I think election campaigns are really important because they put the candidates and the ideas under a pressure that Dutton's never been under, and he failed.
Yeah.
I will say, though, I do think there needs to be some credit given to Labor, particularly to Paul Erickson, in how he handled that part of Trump when Trump was definitely on the ascension, because there was a big group within Labor who were getting shaky and thinking we've got to go and try and limit the damage. But there were also calmer minds, and I would say that Paul Erickson was, definitely one of them. He runs the Labor campaigns for anyone at home who's not familiar with that name. And the idea being that the longer you wait, the more likely the impacts of Trump's campaigning and also his policies will start to turn people away. And that was something that I think Labor was aware of, but the coalition just went full speed ahead. I mean, it was only recently, in the last couple of months, when Trump was coming up with his absolutely insane, we're going to turn Gaza into a US beach resort, when Peter Dutton was asked about that, he said, I think it was on Ben Fordham on 2GB, he's a big thinker. They sound like great ideas. And it's horrifying to think that the US president is saying we're going to come in and we're going to take this sovereign land in Palestine, we're going to raise it, we'll move all the Palestinians out, and then we're going to turn that into a beach resort, to the point where they had AI ads for the Trump Elon Musk beach resort in Gaza, and the opposition leader in Australia going, big thinker,
big
great idea, I'm going to be just like that guy.
Yeah.
So by the time the election campaign came round and the Zelensky press conference happened, but also the tariffs, they had nowhere to go because they had painted themselves so closely aligned as being like Trump, that the moment that they started going, oh, actually, we're not going to be quite like that, we'll be able to stand up to him, people just went, well, will you? Can you?
Yeah, because they had, in particular, things like trying to replicate Doge and the government efficiency, aligning very closely with their policy to sack 40-odd thousand public servants, mostly from Canberra.
All from Canberra.
Canberra, sorry.
Or none. Or we'll just take the Canberrans and we'll move them to other areas. And
by
Come on, Ed,
attrition.
keep up.
By attrition, sorry.
But no voluntary redundancies, but maybe voluntary redundancies.
And none in the security services.
None in, and no frontline.
No. Sorry, Ed.
No, it is worth remembering how much that morphed over the campaign.
But also with the Doge, when he gave Senator Jacinta Price, that title, which was essentially, shadow minister for, government efficiency or whatever it was that he gave her, he already has one. James Stephens is the shadow minister for government waste. So they already had that in their cabinet. It was a conscious choice to turn and say, we are going to paint ourselves, just anoint ourselves in the Timu Trump label and have a direct link to the Doge in the United States.
Yeah.
It truly just showed that they were, I think, seeing the landscape, the electoral landscape, as they saw it and not as it actually was, because I don't think Australians have ever been overly comfortable with Trump's policies en masse.
I agree. I agree about Paul Erickson and the campaign. I'd add that not only did they see the risk to the coalition of Trump, but I think they very cleverly messaged this particularly early by just talking about we don't want to see the Americanisation of Australian policy, which was a very clever dog whistle. It's hard for an Australian Prime Minister to come out and say, yes, the democratically elected president of the US is a bit crazy and I've got no time for him. There are literally diplomatic constraints on what a Prime Minister can or can't say. So I actually think it was very clever of the Labor campaign to talk about we don't want Americanisation, which is actually just a very polite way of sending a very clear message, but not a message that when you then have to go and meet the US president that you have to back away from.
But their campaign was so terrible. Sorry, Ebony, but the coalition campaign was so terrible. We all knew when Liberation Day or whatever that ridiculous title was that Trump was calling Tariff Day, right? We all knew when that was. He had he was advertising, I'm going to be doing Tariff Day on this day. The coalition campaign sent Peter Dutton to Western Australia, where you're already behind because of the time difference. So he could not actually even respond on time to what was happening. So Trump held his press conference. Anthony Albanese walked straight into a Commonwealth office and basically did his big hero press conference where he just said, here's how we're responding to this. This is not an act of a friend. We think this is ridiculous. We will be standing up against it. We will treat defence separately, but we're not negotiating on these things, including the PBS, which immediately put Australia on the offensive instead of being on the defensive. And Dutton, just by the time he actually got in front of a camera, which was hours later, just seemed to be a bit sad that the tariff decision wasn't as bad for Australia as he maybe had hoped. It wasn't worse. It was actually the best one in the world. So he was just this is a terrible outcome, but you could see that he just didn't have a line. And I don't understand how you don't have a line to something that is so forecast. It was obvious this was happening. And as Malcolm Turnbull pointed out, I think he's also said something similar on panels with you, Richard. But he said at the National Press Club, one of the issues for Peter Dutton is that his network, so Gina Reinhardt, the Murdochs, all of that, are very closely aligned with the Trump administration. So yes, he does have better access there if he was Prime Minister. He's got people who can set up a Joe Hockey-style one golf day. But he also risks, if you annoy Trump, annoying your network. And so how do you balance that? Which I think is also something that began to really damage Dutton and the campaign because they had no response.
I also want to ask you, Amy, about, and then I think we might move to talk about some other aspects, but sticking with the coalition and kind of where the wheels fell off, the working from home policy that just seems so ill judged, and it was clearly designed to appeal to a specific section of their political base, but annoyed half the electorate, kind of mainly women.
Who knew that those pesky women voted?
I know.
Who knew?
Concealed that information from the coalition, but it did seem a very big misjudgment that they walked back, but it kind of lost them a lot of trust, I guess, with a big section of the electorate right out the gate, because they just didn't get why that's so important to so many people in the workplace.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why that policy ever made it to the campaign. It was immediate as soon as they announced it, and Jane Hume was basically sent out as the face of this policy. In the weeks after it all fell apart, there were a lot of people within the coalition who were just painting her as the author, essentially. This is all Jane's fault. But they knew immediately that it was not popular. As soon as they announced this, which was before the election campaign, you had people talking about, well, flexible work is actually working for women, it's actually working for families. Anyone with a care responsibility, work from home works for them. And the fear was that if the public service started forcing everyone back to work, the private sector would follow, because the public service essentially sets the conditions that the private sector ends up following.
Yeah.
And so while they were saying it's a scare campaign, this is only for the public service, people who have been through these sort of changes know that if the public service starts doing something, the private sector's just like, well, here we go, we're doing that. And it just, it was immediate. There was an immediate backlash. And it wasn't until their own polling and focus groups started showing them during the campaign just how much this was causing them to bleed votes, because women who had been thinking about returning to the Liberal Party after 2022 started going, actually, you haven't learned anything. Did they change it? And they did the only thing that you could do, which is change it in a big way. So making the announcement on a Monday, we're stopping this, Peter Dutton saying it's the wrong thing to do. But because they didn't have a strong policy platform around that, they had nothing else to turn to. So every single time that they announced another policy, and there ended up being a mistake. And it wasn't just public service, it was also their migration cuts. Like, that's another one where they had like a lot of confusion over, other than the fuel excise and their, some of their later policy announcements like defence, and when they came up with bringing back the low and middle income tax offset, which all came later. They only had policies that were going to men. So, the fuel excise is going to help women because women also are around cars.
We also drive.
We assume some women drive. The men in your lives certainly drive. And they drive these big dumb utes that we've built our entire campaign around. When they were asked, what are you doing for women? They were like, well, we're going to allow them to get into their super so they can get houses. And that's going to be good for women, particularly women who have insecure house. Like, they had nothing. And they basically set themselves on a trajectory with the work from home kerfuffle of telling women, who we know from research tend to be a lot more serious in how they vote. So they will take a step back. They will think about the implications, where men, you're all too emotional. You just immediately just go, I like the look at that guy.
Like the cut of his jib.
Whereas women do think a little bit more about their vote. And I think that particular policy and how they handled it made them go, you're still not here.
Yeah. Richard, I do think there was one policy in particular that Dutton got right, and that was gas and
Absolutely.
taxing gas exports.
Yep.
Tell us a little bit about how that, because that was a real shift essentially for the coalition. How did that come about?
Well, yeah, I agree. And to be clear, I agree with Amy, and it shows that election campaigns bring new things out. Like, it'll be fascinating to watch the Liberals' policy on work from home from here. Like, it'll be a pretty brave Liberal backbencher who bowls up in the
Floats
first
this
parliament
again.
and says, I think we should double down on that.
Polls are closed.
Polls are closed, but, you know...
Yeah, if you're in WA.
Oh, yes, keep voting
Still
in
got
the
a few
WA,
hours in
don't give
WA.
up. So I'll come to the gas in a sec, but I guess my point is when politicians are seeking office, when they're out there in front of the voters saying, here's what I think, there's crystal clear proof in this campaign that they care about how people think. And it's really easy in Australia these days. So many people, nothing works and democracy's broken and blah, blah, blah. No, look at that. The Liberals went, hey, let's have a half-baked idea about work from home. Oh, actually, I'd rather be in government than hold a dumb policy position.
Yeah.
Allow me to shift. So that's good. I mean that. We need to see the political power of that. And similarly, yes, Peter Dutton opened this campaign by saying something shocking. He said Australia does not have a shortage of gas. Let me say it again. Dutton started the campaign, actually the day before the campaign, in his budget and reply speech. He said Australia does not have a shortage of gas, and he's spot on about that. And we at the Australia Institute, we've been putting up with nonsense for 10 years with people saying Australia, one of the largest exporters of gas in the world, has a shortage of gas and we just need to drill for more gas. Dutton jumped the shark, chasing votes maybe, but what he said was true. He said Australia doesn't have a shortage of gas. We've got plenty of gas, and what we need to do is regulate the big gas companies differently. And he actually proposed a new tax on gas. Good. This is not me saying I think Peter Dutton's climate policy is good. This is not me saying I think Peter Dutton said a lot during this campaign that should make voters think, yes, I'll have one of those. But, we say at the Institute, we barrack for ideas, not for parties. Dutton was right to say that we don't have a shortage of gas. He was right to say putting a tax on gas exports would help. And, he's not alone in that. And we need to celebrate that. Some people mocked it. The Fin Review were very shocked and surprised. The Australia Institute and Peter Dutton might agree with something. Well, that's silly. There's lots of things that most sensible Australians agree with, including that there isn't a shortage of gas. But him saying it was really significant. And we actually polled this, and 71% of coalition voters backed him on this. It was one of his most popular things he said during this election campaign. And we even took out a full-page ad with quotes from Peter Dutton, quotes from Pauline Hanson, quotes from Jackie Lambie, quotes from
The Greens,
David Pocock, quotes from Adam Banton, quotes from Richard Dennis, all there saying everyone agrees we don't have a shortage of gas. And I think that what election campaigns do is say, look at all the things we disagree about, and that's right and that's fair, and we test that during an election campaign. But going into the next parliament, it's also really important to say, you know what, nearly everyone agrees we don't have a shortage of gas. Chris Bowen kind of mumbled it out. Yeah, we don't really have a shortage. He didn't want to say it clearly because he doesn't want to agree with Peter Dutton on anything.
Yeah.
He's like, but we really should be talking about nuclear that was never going to happen. But, yeah, this election campaign's flushed out a lot of things. It's flushed out that everyone, including Chris Bowen, under pressure, agrees we don't have a shortage of gas. Which begs the question, after the election, if Labor's returned, how are they going to justify big new gas projects like the North West Shelf? The first words out of their mouth are going to be, because we've got a shortage of gas.
Yeah.
No, we don't. The second line of defence will be, well, we get all our tax from them. Not even Peter Dutton agrees we don't. So this election campaign, even though I think Peter Dutton's going to lose, but win, lose or draw, the reality is at least we all could see under the pressure of election that we've been lied to.
Yeah.
There is no shortage of gas.
Well, and that it's in particular, I'm really interested that taxing gas exports is actually genuinely
Very
a popular policy. So I just wonder, putting your economist hat on for a second, Richard.
Get the shine off my dome.
Yeah, can you, that is a significant policy issue that Australia has really screwed up over the last 10 to 15 years. Can you explain to us why that's actually a good policy?
Yeah. Okay. So, well, there's lots of things here. One's Australia's the third largest exporter of fossil fuels in the world, enormous exporter of gas, enormous exporter of coal. We put out some research just before the election. Australian coal exporters had their best ever month. Like under Labor, coal exports, record high. Yay, if you're into that. But if you're into tackling climate change, this is terrible. But let me start with the economics before I talk about the climate change. When you've got a continent almost the size of the USA and a population about the size of Singapore, it's not surprising that per capita we have an enormous amount of resources. But when you dig stuff up and sell it, you only get to sell it once. So how much your society gets for that is incredibly important. And the Saudis get that, and the Qataris get that, and the Norwegians get that, which is why people in Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Norway feel rich when the price of energy surges.
Yeah.
Like, let's be clear, if you're a major exporter of fossil fuels and the world price of fossil fuels goes through the roof, you should be happy. From an economic point of view, if you sold strawberries and the price of strawberries trebled, you'd be happy.
Yeah.
Okay, well, the price of our major exports in the sense of energy, coal and gas have gone up thanks to Putin invading Ukraine, but we feel poor. We're not going, oh, how will we spend our windfall? How rich are we now? We're like, oh no, isn't gas expensive?
Yeah.
Isn't electricity expensive? How will we cope? Well, the answer is Australians should be getting a much bigger slice of the action. And Dutton saw the politics of that. But this is important. The Greens see the politics of that. Jackie Lambie sees the politics of that. David Pocock sees the politics of that. You know, if we as a nation want to be a bit smart, it's a big if, we know what to do. We need to be taxing these exports rather than literally letting foreign-owned companies, we give them free gas, they pay no tax here in Australia. I'm choosing my words carefully. Impex, overwhelmingly Japanese-owned company. We know it's paid no royalties, we know it's paid no petroleum resource rent tax, and we know it's paid no company tax. But they're making a fortune selling our gas.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we shouldn't be approving new gas projects. We shouldn't be approving new coal projects because climate science is real. Choosing my words carefully here, you need to be a science denier to say that more coal and more gas is good for the climate. There's no science that says we need new coal and gas. So we've got to get past the proper climate denial, which is about exports. But even for the exports we've still got from the existing mines, Australians should be doing everything we can to get as much money out of them before they close down and before we have to ask, well, how are we going to afford to protect ourselves from the climate change that all that caused?
Yeah, and I'm wondering now, this is our first experiment for our first live election coverage night, but I know we've got a video about big gas taking the piss. I'm wondering if we can cut to that video shortly, because it's been a big issue that the Australia Institute has been working on for a number of years. And as you said, it's like, we don't have to keep making these poor policy decisions. It is something that's within our control to change those policy parameters.
Yep.
And
the next Parliament can.
Exactly.
If Albo wins tonight,
yeah,
he will need the Greens in the Senate, and Labor plus the Greens will have enough votes in the Senate to do as much on the climate change as Labor wants. So, yeah, you bet we can.
Yeah. Are we able to throw to that video?
Yep, I see a thumbs up.
Yep.
Here we go, here's a test.
Okay, Susie. Judy, do you want anything more?
Cheers, everything. Oh, no, I'm all right. I'm all good. Oh,
Big Gas takes 56% of our gas for free. That's just taking the piss. It's time Parliament acts. Authorised by the Australia Institute, Canberra.
So, Richard, I mean, as I said, the Australia Institute has been working on this for a number of years now, and there's few other policies, I think, that we've stuffed up as much as we have the management of our gas resources.
Australia,
in particular.
not the Australia Institute. You mean?
Yes, sorry, just to be clear. And I guess, like this really does represent a big shift in that narrative. We've got political consensus across the parliament that Australia has no gas shortage. That's basically a lie that we've been fed for years now. And as you said, there's a really big chance for this next parliament to change course on this and stop. Like, we don't have to keep making this mistake. We can be raising more revenue at the very least from the gas industry.
Look, step one, we should stop approving new ones. The ones we've already got will be providing coal and gas for at least a decade, in some cases 2. So no one's saying shut it all down tomorrow, turn the lights out. That's the straw man argument used by others. So if we stop approving new ones tomorrow, there's going to still be coal and gas getting dug up and exported in Australia. And the consequence of that is that we can tax that as much as we want. Because, I mean, the beautiful thing usually, what the business community do, you say, oh, we're going to put a tax on something. And they're like, if you put a tax on, we'll stop investing.
Or we'll move overseas.
Good. See above. Like, we don't want any more of we don't want you to invest in new coal and gas. So this is the perfect time in Australian history. If we've got a super majority of parliamentarians who say they're committed to climate action, this is the perfect time in Australian history to say, right, enough already. There's plenty of gas here. There's plenty of coal here. We're going to keep exporting and producing from the mines we've already got, but we're not going to open any new ones. You know, if you were a tobacco company and you said, I'm going to transition out of tobacco by building a new tobacco refinery, or nicotine farm, no one would take you seriously. So we know what the science says. It'd be great for the economy to just tax the ones we've got, and I think the numbers will be there for that after the election. But whether I think what will happen, unfortunately, is if Labor retain government tonight, they'll say we can't do anything ambitious on climate until there's bipartisan consensus.
Yeah.
We care about climate too, but we can't do that until the Liberals vote for it. Well, the whole point of democracy is to figure out who do we put in Parliament. Parliament isn't consensus.
Yeah. It's majority.
It's majority. Yeah. So whether Labor win a majority tonight or not, Labor plus crossbench plus the Greens, there's going to be a majority for ambitious climate action. So there's no parliamentary barrier to doing more. The barrier is a purely political one, and that's the political one of giving the Liberals a veto.
Yeah.
So we'll only do it if you want to do it, Peter.
And ignoring the other votes that are right there in the parliament willing to do stuff on climate.
And to be clear, how did they get industrial relations laws through the parliament? Did they say, hey, Liberals, can we come together on this because you can only have lasting reform when we come together. So when they're doing their AUKUS stuff, when they're doing their industrial relations stuff, there are two entirely different political logics behind that. Yeah. And whether Albo or the next Labor leader is going to say, I'd like to help you, but the Libs vote against me, they might say, well, how'd you get IR reform through? Yeah. You went and asked the Greens, you went and asked the crossbench, you got the numbers, you changed the laws, good. They were good law changes. But the idea that the Libs get veto, no, that's nonsense.
Which brings me back to minor parties and independents. Obviously, the vote for them has been growing. A number of more independents contesting this time around, Amy. What are some of the key things that have come out of you've got the Greens as the major minor party, if you will. On the far right, you've got Trumpet of Patriots, Pauline Hanson's One Nation, and then kind of in the centre right, I guess the Teals and some of those community independents. What are some of the key things that have come through from their campaign?
Well, it's all basically been climate for them. Climate and integrity, the same things that they were running on in 2022 and for some people in 2019 and 2016 before that is the same issues, and as well as change. So change with the tax system, change in how we treat housing, change with how we treat rentals. I mean, we're going to have a generation of people who will probably rent for the rest of their lives, and we actually need to start changing the way that we enable them to have secure housing as renters, because we always have the assumption that you only rent until you are able to buy a home. That's never been the case for some people, but if the case is now that a lot more people will not ever be buying a home, then what are we doing for those people to make sure that they can actually make a home in the rental that they're in?
Yeah.
So that's something that the Greens have been running on, and it has been picked up by some of the independents as well. It's going to be it's going to be a bit of a mixed bag, and I know that everyone obviously already says that, but I mean, Queensland could end up delivering Labor the majority that they want, potentially at the expense of the Greens. So 3 seats from the Greens are up for grabs. There's 2 seats from the coalition, which could potentially offset what is happening in Victoria. But then the Greens could also take from Labor in Victoria, which means that then they're going to still maintain that influence. Then you have seats like Bradfield, where, you know, you've got a very good chance of having another Teal independent elected. You've got Wannon, where I've just seen that apparently Chris Uhlmann on the Sky coverage has said that 50% of Colac has come back for the Liberals. So I'm sure, Alex Dyson is just hanging up his hat already. Wannon is a potential. Cowper is a potential. Calare may not go back to the Nationals. Monash, there seems to be a stronger than usual independent vote, and not just because Russell Broadbent is splitting the vote there. There is a movement happening in Nationals electorates, and I think Richard's previously called it the TANs, where we're going to start, that's Nats backwards for anyone playing at home, and also their pants, where we're going to start seeing more community independence from regional communities, which we traditionally associate with being pro-mining and, you know, pro-conservative policies, where their demographics are changing, the communities are changing, which could potentially be a massive issue for the Nationals if they don't start actually changing their policies to reflect the changing demographics of their areas. But it's also because in those communities, they tend to be the poorest in Australia. They have some of the worst infrastructure in Australia, and nobody has actually ever said, we are going to materially change things for you, because for the most part, in the major parties, you're too busy focusing on your own career progression. So you're always trying to get into the ministry or the shadow ministry, which means you're not rocking the boat, which means you're not screaming about infrastructure, you're not screaming about inequality, you're not screaming about climate. You know, we've seen the Nationals basically change from being the party of farmers to the party of miners, where, you know, you've got more mining companies encroaching into food bowl areas, particularly when it comes to gas and fracking and things like that. And the Nationals being all like, this is great, which the community is going, actually, no, it's not.
Yeah.
So we are seeing a very big shift that is not just because we're seeing more people under the age of 45 come to, you know, political prominence. It's because communities that are feeling and living these changes from the climate, and also decades of structural issues, particularly when it comes to inequality, are starting to push back and go, actually, no, you haven't done anything for us. So we're going to start moving. And we are seeing that across the board in Australian electorates. I think that if Australia has a majority parliament this time around, it may be the last one that happens for the foreseeable future.
Because you've got, I mean, independents in rural electorates are, you know, quite different, I guess. Cathy McGowan and then subsequently Helen Haynes, not cut from the same cloth necessarily as someone like Bob Katter, who's been extremely...
It's independent.
Yeah,
sorry.
independents I meant. But I'm just interested that it isn't just a phenomenon of the inner city, which I think kind of emerged as a bit of the story from the last election, but it's not really true. We've got independents popping up all over the place.
Well, of course, and it sort of shows how short the history, our political history, is allowed to be. I mean, you know, Cathy McGowan won the seat of Indi, 2010, 2013?
Yeah.
But of course, you know, Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott, former National Party seats. And as you said before, Bob Katter, there's been all sorts of independents at state and federal elections that have won National Party seats. And indeed, what was shocking to so many was that could happen in inner city seats. So when Zali Steggall beat Tony Abbott, that wasn't supposed to happen. You know, independents don't happen here they happen out there in the bush. And then, of course, in 2022, we had, so many seats fall to independents campaigning on climate and accountability. So now people are getting shocked again and go, oh, hang on, but it could happen in the bush. It's like, well, it's already happened in the bush. What I think is really interesting is that the Nats have clearly dragged the Liberals so far to the right that the Liberals can't hold what were once their safest seats.
They're blue ribbon seats, as they used to be called.
Right? The Nats ruined that for them, but the Nats aren't right-wing enough that they can fend off One Nation. So this compromise between the Liberal National coalition isn't working for either of them at the moment. So Amy's right about, there's a very good chance Australia will have a last majority government at some point. It could have been the last one. It could be tonight's. Who knows? It's not uncommon around the world or in other states. But whether the coalition would prefer to stay in coalition or stay in opposition is a real challenge for them, because sticking tight and finding a compromise that's too right-wing for the inner city and, not conservative enough for the Hanson voters, what's the point of that?
Yeah.
Now, I don't know, but it's a tough choice for them to have to make going forward.
Yeah. We've got a few questions coming in from people who are watching the live stream, so I thought I might...
Before we do, I've had a few great texts tonight.
Oh, yeah.
But you have.
A few have been about Amy's cardigan, and I've been asked to give that a shout out. No one's commented on my nice jacket yet, Eb, or yours.
Well, I think your hair looks great.
Thank you very much. A boy likes to make an effort. And also, lots of people suggesting that they've actually been bored by people saying the election coverage has been boring, and that they're enjoying just actually talking about what did happen.
And a bit more of policy, I guess.
Yeah.
So I've got a question here. Is it possible that Labor could refuse to form minority government with the Greens? Richard, I'll throw that one to you
Well,
first.
it's absolutely possible.
Stupid.
What they did in Tasmania. So after the last Tasmanian...
Which was stupid.
Well, again, I'm a Democrat. I support people's rights to do stupid things.
I'm a benevolent dictator.
As long as
So.
they're constitutional, I'll cut them some slack. So after the last Tasmanian state election, Labor and the Greens together could have formed a majority, but I think it was the day after the election, Labor came out and said, no, we have no interest in even having that conversation. We, the Labor Party of Tasmania, would rather the Liberals form government than us even sit down and talk to crossbenchers about how that might work. So, yep, to whoever wrote in, it's entirely up to the leader of a political party. What's interesting is, and this was ventilated after that last Tasmanian election, people were saying, what if Labor and Liberal leaders refuse to form a government? And the interesting answer to that is the Governor-General can tell them to pull their head in and do the job they were elected to do, which is not lead their party. Let's be clear, under the Constitution, parties aren't mentioned in that sense at all, and Prime Ministers aren't mentioned in the Constitution. We all elect a Member of Parliament to go to Canberra to represent our electorate, and it's the job of parliaments to figure out how to organise themselves. So in the very unlikely instance that both leaders of both major parties say, stuff it, I don't want the job, they're not actually in charge at that point. And it would be the Governor-General who would have to conclude that we need to have a new election or something.
And it won't be clear until later this evening who is elected in the lower house in the case of a minority government, and what the numbers are to determine, whether or not it makes more sense to go with a bigger voting bloc like the Greens or move to independence, those kinds of things. So it's a little bit of an open question. I've also got another question here. Has Trump made it hard for Conservative politicians here? Amy, I might throw that one to you.
Yeah, it's interesting because, if you're Pauline Hanson or Clive Palmer, I don't think Trump's made things hard. I think that your voter base probably embraces everything that Trump is doing in terms of, chaos and being a disruptor. I think it's made it harder for the traditional Conservative Conservatives with the Liberals, because like if they believe in a free market, then Trump obviously doesn't, and it's a hard sell to say I believe in a free market, but I also support what Trump is doing to that free market. And also, just to Richard's point, like, you know, they can't go at the moment within their guardrails of being a party of government as far to the right as Trump has gone, while still maintaining their base outside of the base that we always talk about, you know, feeding blood to the base. That middle and upper rung of people who still vote Liberal, you know, they can't go as far to the right with that. So it does make it quite difficult if you're painting yourself as, you know, the Trump light, but you don't have any other voters coming in to replace the voters that you may put off with doing that. And that's the issue that they fell into. I think also it wasn't even so much Trump's policies. I think it all very much became a point of sovereignty, of Australian sovereignty against what Trump was doing. And, you know, a form of nationalism where we were going, oh, hey, like this ally that we've always counted on, Australia's, you know, closest or exceptional friend, as Emma Shortis has written extensively about, is being batshit crazy, and that could have massive implications for us should we maybe stand up against him. And I think when you saw what Mark Carney did in Canada, where he immediately just threw up the blocks and it was elbows up and refusing to take Trump's call and refusing to kowtow to what Donald Trump was doing, that kind of invigorated, I think, sections of the community who have been waiting to see Australia start to stand up, using the quite significant power that we have to actually say, no, get out of here. We're going to start doing our things our own way. And I mean, Jackie Lambie probably galvanised a hell of a lot of voters when she was standing up just saying, well, just kick them out of our bases, like get them out of Pine Gap, or we're putting up the rent by, you know, $300 million. Like, this is outrageous. And the support that she was getting for those comments, and that the Greens were getting for them saying, like, we're really worried about AUKUS. You saw Teal Independents start to stand up and saying, we want a parliamentary review into AUKUS and this relationship. We've had our own polling, which has shown that people are more afraid or more wary of Donald Trump than they are of Putin or Xi Jinping. The Sydney Morning Herald polling started showing that. I think ABC's Vote Compass started showing that. There is obviously a mood within the Australian electorate to stand up against other countries bullying Australia, and that is what Trump has represented, and that is what the coalition has failed to see.
I want to stick with hung parliaments and thinking about how all of that might work. The first results are just starting to come in, and we might just go to check on some of those in a minute. But I'm also wondering, we've got a video about Bill Brown, head of our Democracy and Accountability Program, explaining kind of how a hung parliament works for those who might not live in New South Wales or the People's Republic of ACT with more recent experience of it. I'm wondering if we can throw to that in a second.
Yep, thumbs up.
Because I think it is one of the key outcomes that we could expect from tonight's results. And we might come back after that, if that's all right, to some of the actual results.
We've already had Anthony Green's computer not work.
Bingo! So, hung parliaments, Richard, you were talking before about the fact that, I mean, they're quite common internationally. They're even quite common around Australia.
Yep.
And they kind of put the parliament in a bit of a different mood when everyone knows they kind of have to negotiate to get anywhere. Less combative, more combative? How did it work recently?
Just different combat. I mean, this is what gets me. Like, Parliament is, as Paul Keating said, politics is the conflict business. So if the Prime Minister has a majority in the lower house, then the Prime Minister is in permanent conflict with their ministers and their backbench about what to do and how to do it. And everybody knows about factions, and everybody knows about numbers, and everybody knows about how these things happen. But apparently, if it's Labor backbenchers or Labor ministers knocking the edges off policy and saying, well, I'll do this, but only if you do that, Apparently, if that's top secret and invisible, it's fine.
Yeah.
But the minute you've got a block of votes from Labor or a block of votes from the Liberals having to negotiate visibly with independents and crossbenchers, saying, look, we'd like to pass this law. I know you don't like the look of it. You know, if we amended it in some way, would you support it? If that negotiation happens in the Labor Party room or the Coalition Party room, that's fine. But we're told it's chaos if we see that negotiation. Now, I actually happen to think the exact opposite is true. I actually like seeing the negotiation. I like seeing what price was paid. Because the prices get paid all the time. We know the prices get paid all the time. We just have to wonder about it.
Yeah.
And in so-called minority government, the chaos is no more chaotic, it's just more transparent. And rather than I'm the Prime Minister and I'm in charge and I say what we'll do, no, Prime Ministers get rolled by their backbench and their cabinet. We just never see it.
Can we go to that video?
Yep, thumbs up.
Just imagine, it's the day after the election. You've voted for who you want to be your local member to represent your community in the House of Representatives. You've got your democracy sausage. But as you watch the results come in, you might see commentators saying we have a hung parliament. This might not happen, but polling shows there's every chance it could. But what does it actually mean? There are 150 members in the House, so a majority is 76. If 76 Labor MPs get elected, they have a majority and Anthony Albanese is still the Prime Minister. If 76 coalition, so that's Liberal or National MPs, are elected, then Peter Dutton becomes Prime Minister. What if no party gets the magic 76 seats needed for a majority? Well, that's a hung parliament. Whoever wants to be Prime Minister has to keep the confidence, basically not lose the support, of a majority of MPs, including independents and MPs from minor parties. The Prime Minister in that case would lead what's called a minority government, or, if there are formal extensive commitments, a coalition government, like the coalition between the Liberals and Nationals. And either way, sharing power means negotiations and compromise. While minority governments specifically have been rarer at the national level, Australia Institute research shows they're common in the states and territories, and coalition governments have been common federally as well. If you live in New South Wales, Tasmania, or the ACT right now, you already live under a minority government, and most of the other states have had minority governments in the last 20 years too. There are pretty good odds of a minority government after this federal election because the vote for independents and minor parties has been growing from single digits in the 70s to 32% at the last election. That's almost 1 in 3 voting outside the major parties. So is there anything to fear from a hung parliament and a power-sharing government? Journalist Rachel Withers suggests yes, if you're a fossil fuel, alcohol or gambling company. We know the big polluters are scared of minority government because they've said so. Gas export companies say a minority government would be a nightmare and a quiet menace. The coal lobby says democratically elected independents would be vested interests funded by big renewables. Talk about projecting. Meanwhile, the gambling and alcohol lobby is funding both the government and the opposition in seats where the major parties are threatened by independent candidates. But despite all the fear-mongering about them, we actually know that minority governments can be successful. The last federal minority government elected was the Gillard Labor government. It passed over 500 pieces of legislation, the highest daily rate of any Australian government. And that's including ambitious reforms like the Clean Energy Future Package, the Minerals Resource Rent Tax, and the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So having to negotiate and compromise with other voices doesn't mean the government grinds to a halt. And our political leaders can't be too worried. After all, opposition leader Peter Dutton says he's willing to negotiate with independents to form a minority government. In the ACT, Labor has governed with the support of the Greens for almost 20 years. South Australia has a majority government, and they still appointed 2 independent ministers even though they didn't have to. So whether you're planning to vote for a major party, minor party, or an independent, that's completely your choice. But you should make that choice without worrying about a hung parliament. These are not uncommon, and when they occur, they are the will of Australian voters.
So that's one of the possible outcomes from tonight's results. The results are starting to come in, but it's still extremely early. Early votes are trickling in from some booths, but too early to call, as is one of the
That's
favourite.
not a bingo thing, though, that you can't use that as a bingo one.
But it's one of the outcomes for tonight. And I will just say, if you are joining us, thanks for joining us this evening. We'll probably wrap up here about 7:30. And if you've got questions, I'm not sure whether people are leaving them on the Facebook page or on YouTube, but they are coming through to us. So if you've got more questions, send them through and we'll try and get through some more of those this evening. But Richard, we also did some polling around power sharing and what people think about it. And others, people who vote for independence and others, it's quite clear that if it ends up in a minority government, hung parliament type situation, people are kind of comfortable, aren't they, with independence kind of choosing what, the best party?
Yeah, look, amazingly, it's a real shock to some people, particularly people who work in major political parties. People who vote for an independent or a minor party are not that big a fan of the major parties. So what our polling shows, and we've done polling in the lead up to the election, what it shows is that a clear majority of people who voted for an independent or a crossbencher, or people who are planning to vote today for an independent or a crossbencher, what their preference is for an independent or crossbencher who wins to make a decision about who should form government based on what that candidate or that elected MP thinks is best for Australia and for their electorate. So no real kind of shock there, but I think, you heard Peter Dutton saying this a lot through the campaign. Independent MPs should come out and tell me now who they will support. Is voting for Sophie Scomps or Monique Ryan, are they just there to deliver government to Labor, or are they just there to deliver votes for the government to the Liberals? In fact, most independent MPs and most people who vote for independent MPs clearly have quite something different in mind, which is, I want to put this person in Parliament. I think this person represents me best. And then because I trust them with my vote, I trust them to go and figure out, well, what would be best for the country and for my electorate. So shouldn't shock people.
People who vote independent like their independent members to be independent.
Yeah, I mean, just on independence, again, early, very, very early, but the count from Bean, I mean, Jesse Price, which is the ACT seat of Bean, has currently got more votes than David Smith, which is not something that the Labor MP, which is not something we would usually see at this point in the ACT, given how, that fight tends to be out. So, you could end up even seeing another independent come out of ACT.
Wow, that would be a turn up.
It would be a turn up. I want to talk a little bit about, Richard, the cost of living, which has been a huge issue this campaign, but also, I guess, over the last couple of years with inflation really causing a lot of problems. Excessive corporate profits really driven up a lot of prices over the last few years, and people are really struggling out there to make ends meet. We're hoping to have a guest come in soon to talk a little bit about this, but can you just describe for us, obviously the start of this campaign, we had a budget handed down just beforehand, and cost of living was really one of the focuses of that. What have we ended up with on the whole out of this campaign that's really going to address those cost of living issues?
Look, I think it's quite clear that Labor took a better cost of living package to the election, and I'm not surprised that throughout the campaign their policies have polled better. Labor in government, in all of their budgets have done things around energy price relief, for example. And that was a really important thing. What Labor was doing was saying, we know electricity prices have gone up. Here, have some money, make that cheaper. Guess what? That worked for people. That worked quite well. The other thing that Labor have been clearer about is that they want to see wages, particularly the wages of the lowest paid workers, rise faster. And it's all a bit fake to talk about cost of living crises if you're not willing to talk about wage growth. So in Australia, if prices are going up faster than wages, then everyone is going to fall behind. This is just maths. If the price of stuff is rising faster than your income, you're going backwards. So the only way to help the lowest paid people in Australia with a so-called cost of living crisis, which is actually a real wage crisis and an inadequate welfare crisis, the only way to help people at the bottom is to either give them higher wages, give them higher benefits, or do what Labor's done, give them some sort of supplement to help them cope with these high prices. So, I think we need to understand quite clearly that when it comes to cost of living is not some abstract thing. It's not like bad weather that comes and ruins your picnic. A cost of living crisis is a sustained period of prices in shops, prices for services, prices for electricity and mobile phones going up faster than wages, and we need to fix that. And wages are a big part of that, and cost of living supplements are a big part of that, and I think the Liberals made a mess of it.
We're going to cross now to Kristen O'Connell, who's the spokesperson from the Anti-Poverty Centre. Kristen, can you hear us there?
Yeah, sure can.
Thanks so much for joining us tonight. We were just talking about how much cost of living has been a feature of this election campaign. How much has poverty and the relieving people from poverty been an issue that you think the political parties have covered? How much of an issue has it been in this campaign, do you think?
It feels like they've both done worked as hard as they could to avoid talking about it at the beginning of this term or during the last election. Anthony Albanese talked about leaving no one behind. We haven't heard any such talk this time. We heard one promise from the Labor Party in the last election, which was to scrap compulsory cashless welfare, which causes enormous harm to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and they did nothing. The Coalition attempted to confect outrage over that, but really that's all we've gotten, and it's been really under the radar, particularly considering how much worse things are feeling for people and how little action has been taken over the last 3 years.
And Kristen, can you just tell us a little bit about what that actually looks like for people? What are some of the stories that you're hearing from the community about people who really just can't make ends meet anymore?
I think there's two things. There's our material needs and the fact that, like, for lots of us, rents are higher. A lot of statistics get used that show averages, might show rents not rising as quickly as some of us are experiencing. So more people are becoming homeless because when your rent goes up, that's eviction by a rent increase for those of us on the lowest incomes. Everything feels more expensive, and we had those energy so-called bill relief payments, but then lots of us saw our bills go up. Lots of welfare recipients were reporting that their bills went up by more than the value of that subsidy, and that they got those letters right after the subsidies were announced. And I think that the kind of one of the worst impacts has actually been the sense of hopelessness and despair that has really increased, partly because I think a lot of poor people did really hope that the Labor government would mean their life might slightly improve. And 3 years down the track, and with no sign of any potential interest for improvement if Labor are re-elected, I think people are feeling much more distressed than they were 3 years ago.
Can you talk to me a little bit about the unemployment benefit? And we know obviously that's inadequate. It has been so for a long period of time. Has there been anything in the campaign that would give you hope that that might be addressed in the next parliament?
We did see the Prime Minister have a little tantrum this week when he was asked by a Guardian journalist what was going to happen for the rate of job seeker. To be clear, no Centrelink payments are adequate, but job seeker is $220 a week below the poverty line, and youth allowance is even lower. The Prime Minister essentially said that the government's employment policies are the answer to poverty, and it's really sickening to hear that when we know that it is the government and the Reserve Bank of Australia's position that we should have around 4% of people unemployed. So it's a policy choice to have unemployment, and at the same time, they blame unemployed people for not having a job and punish us with poverty and punish people with extremely damaging and dangerous mutual obligations as well. And I think one thing that has been really missing from this campaign is discussion of the government's second largest procurement, which is for privatised employment services, which is worth $4 billion a year. The week before the election, the Secretary of the Employment Department announced that large swathes of the system had been operating unlawfully, and we haven't heard a word about it. So it's really, you kind of feel invisible, 5 million of us having to rely on a Centrelink payment of some sort, but no discussion.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty gutting, I'm sure. And obviously, times are really tough out there. You've talked about people who are relying on unemployment benefits. I want to just go back as well to the housing issue, because I know it's one of the key reasons why people are struggling to make ends meet. But it does seem like housing has been much more of a focus during this campaign. What are some of the policies that you think would most help people who are either relying on unemployment benefits or who otherwise are really struggling to make ends meet? What are some of the policies that would genuinely help people?
I think what we have seen is that over time, public housing has been decimated. That has happened under both political parties. And at the end of the day, we need a landlord of last resort that isn't 10 years down the road. I'm currently not even on the public housing waiting list, even though I qualify for it, because the amount of paperwork it takes to get it done and how, pointless that seems means I don't even, have the energy to try. So I think the obvious thing to do would be to directly invest in public housing. There is currently about $15 billion a year being spent out of our welfare payments to pay private landlords. So if the government spent even a fraction of that directly building public homes, our rents would go down, our payments would be more livable, and a whole lot of people on payments would benefit, a whole lot of people in public housing would benefit, but that also benefits everyone who's relying on the private rental market, because it really stabilises and provides an alternative to having to live in private rentals.
And Kristen, we don't yet know the results of the election this evening, but if you had a message for the next parliament, what are some of the key things that you would like the next parliament to tackle to help lift people out of poverty so that they're not struggling to, pay the rent plus put food on the table, for example?
The fastest and most effective thing that the government can do, and that the crossbench should push for if there is a minority parliament, is to increase all Centrelink payments to at least the poverty line, and then work with low-income people on Centrelink payments to actually figure out a sophisticated poverty measure for the 21st century. But there is so much more to be done. That is a triage measure at best. That investment in public housing, the abolishment of compulsory mutual obligations, actually delivering on the promise made 3 years ago to get rid of cashless welfare, and to work with the states to get really strong protections in place for private renters, because we know public housing investment will take time to benefit enough people for it to make a difference.
Look, I might have some good news for you, Kristen, and I don't mean early results, don't trust them, but I'm just looking at an exit poll conducted by EMC today. And people were asked, if a power-sharing government between independents and a major party delivered the following policies in the next 12 months, would you be more or less positive about the government? The number one response, and to be clear, this isn't Australia Institute polling, it was done by EMC for someone else. The number one response was keep more gas in Australia for Australians. But the number two response was build more government-funded social and affordable housing, with 60% of people saying that would make them more favourable towards the government, and importantly, 8% of people opposed. So, it's fascinating what you've said. It makes me sad, frankly, that I live in one of the richest countries in the world, and we choose to have an unemployment benefit so low. We choose to have income supports that are so low that so many people live in poverty. I mean, that makes me sad. But looking at results like this, what we can see quite clearly is that the public expect and want more, and the public are saying if we had more of this, they'd be more supportive of the government. So I don't think that's going to make your job easy in the next 3 years, but you're certainly not alone in pushing for this. And yeah, fingers crossed we get a good result tonight. But what we really need is whoever forms government to actually be ambitious about fixing this and not just come up with excuses where, as you've heard too many times, presumably in the last 10 years, I'd like to help poor people, I'd just rather give tax cuts to high income earners, or I'd like to help, women fleeing domestic violence, or just, parents struggling with a kid. We'd like to help them, but actually let's buy some submarines instead. So anyway, I just wanted to give you some good news before the early booths get counted. You're not alone in this, and I encourage you to check out that EMC exit poll.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for joining us this evening, Kristen. And where can people find out more information about the Anti-Poverty Centre's work?
Yeah, you can find us on all social media platforms, most of them anyway, at Anti-Poverty Cent, all one word. And we also have a link tree. If you do linktree/Anti-Poverty Cent, you can find all of our links and work there.
Thanks so much for joining us. That was Kristen O'Connell, who's a spokesperson for the Anti-Poverty Centre. They're talking about some of the key issues that are coming up for so many Australians who are really struggling to make ends meet, and her hopes for what the next Parliament can deliver to help fix some of those problems. And Amy Remeikis has just stepped out for a little while, and I'm joined now by my colleague Bill Brown, head of the Australia Institute's Integrity and Accountability program. Bill, thanks so much for joining us this evening.
Very exciting to be here.
It is. You've been doing a lot of work around integrity reforms for the next Parliament. We know it was a huge issue at the last election. What are some of the key things that you think will be high on the agenda for the next Parliament, whoever ends up getting elected?
I think we've seen some issues either neglected or not progress nearly as fast as they should have, and whistleblower protections is one classic example. We really should have a whistleblower protection authority that's able to look after whistleblowers, provide legal advice, and even prosecute cases or settle the law for whistleblowers. Instead, we got one of two tranches of whistleblowing reforms only. The other aspect, I think, is better treatment of freedom of information requests. It's still the case that you can put in a request and wait years to get any kind of resolution, and often what you get is very determined attempts to limit the amount of information you get out of the government. I think also the National Anti-Corruption Commission has had a pretty faltering start, you'd have to say. And part of the kind of problems around its creation are the fact that it was given more limited powers than it should have been. The absence of public hearings so far is a testament to how hard they made it to start a public hearing. And we know that those are instrumental in drawing out wrongdoing, in educating people, in showing that justice is done. So that would be a good place for negotiations to start.
Yeah, it certainly would be. And yeah, as you said, the fact that we haven't had any so far, so that they've set the bar so high, feels unlikely that we'll see those kinds of public interrogations. And it is kind of the way justice needs to be seen to be done as well. It does help. I know we've done research into this. It encourages other witnesses to come forward. It gives the public confidence in what's happening when they can kind of see the proceedings. There's a lot of good reasons that the NAC should be able to hold public hearings.
Whenever it's in the public interest, I would say. And indeed, Australians agree. In our polling research, we find that the majority of Australians think that it should be holding them in at least those circumstances, if not whenever they want. We know from New South Wales ICAC that they've had investigations that have only happened because a whistleblower saw a case happening publicly, called in with a tip, and then it gets investigated.
One other thing I wanted to ask you about, Bill, was truth in political advertising. So I'm sure everyone has heard a time or two or received a text message from trumpet of patriots, and
They stopped tonight.
we saw just before the election some reforms went through the parliament that increased public funding for political parties, for example. But there wasn't anything corresponding that would tighten those rules to require them to not be misleading or deceptive in political advertising. Where to from here for that issue, do you think?
Yeah, as you say, it's perfectly legal to lie in a political ad, and I imagine anyone who's been following the election has seen ample evidence of that. We've got a model for truth in political advertising laws because South Australia's had them for 40 years. And actually last year the Albanese government put forward a bill to the Parliament which, if they'd pursued it, if they'd gotten it passed into law, would give us truth in political advertising laws. So it's not a case that they need to do more drafting or anything like that. They've got a working model, but they need to prioritise it. And we haven't seen that happen so far. Instead, the government has said, well, they couldn't get the coalition's support, and therefore they didn't pursue it further. But as we know, they've got they had the numbers. We don't know yet what they'll get this time, but they had the numbers to get it through with the crossbench in the Senate, and presumably there'd still be a majority for that going forward.
We're going to go now to another guest. So we are going across now to Peter George, who is the independent candidate for Franklin. I'm not sure how many of the votes have come in yet for Franklin, but we're crossing now to Peter. Can you hear us there, Peter?
Yes, I can. How are you both?
Very well. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. Do you have any word yet on the early vote count in Franklin?
Not a word so far. Look, as you might imagine, the booth, we've managed to, as an independent campaign, we've managed to get in 15 weeks alone more than 600 volunteers. So we've got virtually all the booths covered. The booth managers are all reporting good turnout in terms of sort of people who are, saying that they'll vote for us, taking our how to vote card, which is very simple. How to vote card is simply vote one Peter George and then follow your conscience. And what's been really interesting is in some of the sort of very heavily Labor areas like Risdon Vale on the eastern shore of Hobart and Warrane, a lot more interest than one might have expected. But, very early days. And of course, booth captains tend to think you're going to win no matter what happens.
And Peter, I want to ask you about some of the key issues that the people on the ground in your electorate that you're running for there in Franklin have said are at the top of their issue list. What do people in Franklin tell you that they really care about this election?
Look, it's broken up in an interesting way. This is a very strange electorate. It goes down the Dontracastro Channel with Bruny Island, Kingston, Margate, the Huon Valley, long coastlines there. And then it's actually broken up. It's broken in half by Andrew Wilkie's, the independent for Clark. And then it goes across to the eastern shore of Hobart, which is a large area, which includes areas where, for instance, there are more electric cars apparently per head of population than anywhere else in Australia. Wealthy, very green, very politically engaged, and then to some of the more sort of where people struggle more in places like Risdon Vale. So what have the main issues been? Where people are doing it very tough, there's something like 75% of the people in the electorate don't really have enough money at the end of the week to see them through. And about 80-something% struggle to pay their mortgages and their rent. So hip pocket, of course, has been very important. On the other hand, over the past few weeks, there has been this outrageous event in our waterways with the salmon farms down here, which has been a story that's gone national that has upset very many people, which is the salmon chunks and fatty globules washing up on our beaches as there's been this outbreak of disease in the southeast, which is where most of the salmon farms are, plus the government's last decision when Liberal and Labor got together and changed the environmental laws, which allowed the industry to go on damaging Macquarie Harbour over on the west coast. So it's been a broad campaign. Our campaign got off the ground because I've been fighting salmon and the salmon industry for the past 12 years, trying to rein them in. We had a rally in Hobart the other day where 6,000 people turned up, which is pretty extraordinary for, on a long weekend for a small city like this. So it's been very broad. We've all been fighting and talking about cost of living and the collapsing medical system down here and poor education. But we've added this particular issue on top of all of that.
Yeah, it sounds like that's been a pretty decisive issue down there. And as you say, like here on the mainland, we saw some really horrific images and footage of the big salmon die-off, I guess. And so what do people want to see happen with that industry? When you say you've been campaigning to rein it in, what are people looking to make happen there to really rein in the salmon industry in Tasmania?
It's pretty simple. We want it out of our waters. For the last, since 2020, we've had the thing called the Dens Point Declaration, which says a moratorium on any form of expansion whatsoever. Secondly, moving out of our waters. And thirdly, an industry which is governed by properly independent regulation and science. It is possible. You cannot have an industry in the 21st century that is damaging our waterways, damaging our marine life, and think that that's okay. Now, it is possible. Around about $4 to $5 billion around the world has been invested in land-based salmon farming. Just in the last 10 days, more than $500 million was raised for moving an Icelandic fish farm onto land. It is doable, but regardless of the outcome, you simply can't have an industry like this, which is unsustainable, damaging, and will be out of our. They're multinationals. They'll be out of our waters in 5 to 7 years anyway, because the waters are warming far too rapidly for Atlantic salmon to survive.
And how are you feeling about your chances this evening? What's your vibe from the campaign?
I'd like to. I don't want to sound like a Pollyanna, but this has been a truly joyful experience. We only started this campaign 15, 16 weeks ago. My wife and I decided that we would make it a campaign particularly about the salmon industry, but also how Tasmania sells off its natural heritage for a pittance, and has done so for too many decades. And it seems to have caught a zeitgeist. We know that the minister, the Labor minister, Julie Collins, she's not been able to leave her electorate for the entire campaign, which is unusual because she is the primary industries minister. One would have expected her to be up in Queensland during the floods when all those ranches got wiped out. Penny Wong, a senior heavy hitter Labor minister, had to come down to launch her campaign. That was a first. So what the pundits are saying is that this independent campaign will give Julie Collins, at the very least, a strong run for her money, or has a chance of sort of giving an upset win. She's only on she only has about a 36% first vote anyway, which makes her vulnerable. I think there is a zeitgeist. I think there are a lot of angry people who don't think Labor or Liberal are delivering. And a lot of people in this electorate actually think about things. And the reports are, many people have agreed that if the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a better result, then Tasmania's been insane for years.
Peter, just a final question from me. It's a tough thing putting yourself up to run for elected office, win, lose or draw tonight. What do you say to voters and what do you say to other people thinking about participating in our democracy as at the pointiest end like you've chosen to do. It's a tough job.
My favorite question. Thank you very much. I spent my life, a lot of my life, as a foreign correspondent, working in difficult parts of the world, where governments change hands in hatred, violence, bloodshed, and this is such a privilege. Being in Australia, it is such a privilege to know that whatever the outcome of this election, whether we like it or not, we're going to wake up tomorrow morning or later in the week, and we're going to know that something happened, something changed, and it happened with peaceably and gently. And the only thing I can say has been negative about it. I have 3 staffers, 3 young women staffers, and the only thing that upsets me is that they have managed my social media, and which I don't bother with much. And I worried, because what they think is normal, the discourse on social media is so vitriolic, so hate-filled, so upsetting, that it really bothers me that they've had to tolerate it. There's some wonderful stuff online, but by God, there's some awful stuff as well.
Peter, we've got some extremely early results here, only a few hundred votes counted, but I will say you're currently sitting on 276 votes from these earliest results, which puts you on 44.23%, with Julie Collins coming in with 155 votes and 24.8%. So you're pulling ahead to an early lead, but that's only with a couple of hundred votes counted. I'm so sorry to be too early.
Let's call it there.
You're probably more in tune with this. My last sort of experience in politics was I was on the steps of Parliament House when Gough Whitlam was sacked as a young political reporter. And I must admit, I did interview Maggie Thatcher and plenty of other political leaders. But those figures, I mean, I think we just open the champagne and say we've got it won, don't we?
Well, congratulations on the campaign. Hopefully for you, the results go just as well in the rest of the count. And if you've got a message for the voters of Franklin or indeed Tasmania, what would that be tonight?
The message is, I hope we all understand that the old parties have really had their day. And if we don't make it this election, we've started a movement which I think is unstoppable. I think the tide has turned.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening, Peter, and good luck for the rest of the evening.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. So we might come back in a little bit to discuss the issue of what's been happening with the salmon industry in Tasmania, because the Australia Institute has done an enormous amount of work over the last few years to protect, in particular, the endangered Maugean skate, which is on the brink of extinction, due in large part or in the main part to the activities of the salmon industry in Tasmania, particularly in Macquarie Harbour, which is the only home for the skate on Earth. And as Peter George said there, it has been a big issue in Tasmania. In addition, they've seen that huge salmon die off and some horrendous footage coming out there, as Peter said, of rotting chunks of salmon washing up on beaches and those kinds of things. But Peter George is obviously, Richard, one of the many independents who are running at this election. And that brings us back to the issue, I guess. The main issue of tonight is, are we going to see a majority government or a minority government situation with a hung parliament? And again, I'll introduce another guest to our panel this evening. Josh Black is one of the postdoctoral fellows at the Australia Institute. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you for having me, Ed.
And Josh, you've been writing a little bit about that issue and how minority parliaments work, and a little bit about our research on there's no such thing as a safe seat anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a few points I think that are really key to get on the table at the outset. One is, I think, the point that Richard made earlier, which is that every day is minority government in the Senate. It's been about 20 years since we saw a government win a majority in the Senate, And if you kind of leave that term out and you go back even further, you need to go to the second term of the Fraser government before you see a government being re-elected with a majority in the Senate. So this just doesn't happen. We're very unlikely to see that tonight. And in terms of making a balanced parliament work, parliaments are older than parties in Australia. I think we often forget this in our political discourse, but parliaments have been around far longer than political parties have. When parties don't win a majority in the lower house, parliaments are designed to work. The sky doesn't fall in. There are all sorts of ways, all sorts of really interesting and creative ways of making a minority government work.
Yeah. Richard, we've seen them happen at the state level, at the federal level, most recently with the Gillard government. Do you feel like it kind of changes that tone? I felt like it did during that campaign. When the government goes in kind of expecting that they have to negotiate, it brings a bit of a different vibe to those negotiations, I guess. Yeah.
Absolutely. And as I said before, those negotiations are more visible, which that might seem messier to people, but just hiding all the mess behind a closed door doesn't make it tidy. So no, personally, as a voter, as a citizen, as someone really interested in democracy and politics and policy, I think the more voices there are in the conversation, the better. I'm a Democrat at heart. What the majority wants, the majority should get. But where the options are, what the options are, where people fall on those options, the more we know about that, the better. I mean, the thing about what happened this Parliament, the Australia Institute was opposed to the Stage 3 tax cuts since Scott Morrison first announced them back when he was Malcolm Turnbull's treasurer. It was a terrible idea. Bill Shorten said in 2019 he was opposed to them. Anthony Albanese went to the 2022 election supporting them. That's fine. It's democracy. We talked about Dutton changing his vote. Labor changed their vote. But then after Labor were elected, we wound up in the middle of this incredible cost of living crisis. And what was obvious was that giving enormous tax cuts, $9,000 a year to the highest income earners and giving nothing to people below $50,000 would be crazy. So, under pressure from voters, the Labor government changed their mind. And it's one of the most popular things they did. Right? Now, when they're in a so-called minority government and you have to negotiate more with more parties more often, then the opportunities to change your mind are greater. And when you change your mind in a way that makes people happy, that's a good thing. You don't, if I promised, let's catch up next week and then I wake up with COVID and I break my promise, this doesn't make me unreliable. It means I adapt to circumstances. I think Australian voters understand that we do want politicians to be serious about the commitments they make, but the commitment to make decisions in the national interest is clearly more important than any particular policy commitment. And having more people in Parliament have a say in that, reminding people of their options, as Josh said, the Parliament's been around longer than parties, and in Australia and around the world, people have sorted this out before.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, I think that process of adaptation is really interesting on the part of voters as well. I think the period of minority government federally from 2010 to 2013 saw, words like chaos and contention thrown around willy-nilly, and it's very easy in the atmosphere, the sort of cut and thrust of a political parliamentary term, to be swept up in that kind of rhetoric. But I think following the end of that parliament, Australians reflected on and adapted to a number of things. They adapted to having had their first woman Prime Minister. This was such an important milestone. They reflected on what the 43rd Parliament was actually able to achieve. A record number of bills, I think 561 pieces of legislation. Some of it, extraordinarily life-changing. The National Disability Insurance Scheme being a really good example. And I think Australians reflected on their comfortability at having a minority government. I think attitudes in the space of a decade changed dramatically in relation to Australians' willingness to have a minority government and to kind of take some sort of ownership over the checks and balances that are built into our parliamentary system. So I think reflection encouraged adaptation in that last decade of Australian politics.
Yeah, and Richard, we've been talking a little bit about the fact that there really is no such thing as a safe seat anymore. Certainly at the last election, there were enormous swings that delivered changes of seats, particularly for the blue ribbon Liberal seats in a lot of the metro areas. How much is that concept of a safe seat just a thing of the past now?
It is a thing of the past. And, you know, it was always the case that no seat was safe, but we just have so much more evidence now that this is not just a theoretical thing, but a very real, significant political thing. So, yeah, to give you an example from the last election, Sophie Scomps, new to politics, you know, independent, never run for Parliament before, ran against Jason Falinski, high-profile member of the Liberal Party, often seen as a leader of the future, and he was in one of the safest seats in the country. Now, safe is this idea that, you know, one party has won by so many votes they couldn't possibly lose. Well, even though Zali Steggall beat Tony Abbott in his safe seat in 2019, people were still like, oh, the Liberals can't lose safe blue ribbon seats. It's like, what, like they did at the last election? Yes, that was a one-off. Well, it wasn't a one-off, and Sophie Scomps won, and Zoe won, and Monique Ryan won, and, you know. So history makes quite clear that it was never the case there were these safe seats. What's now very clear is that even a seat on a 15 or 20% margin might not be safe. And here's the key part: if the right candidate pushing for the right issues pops their hand up and says, well, I'd like to run and I think I could do better. So to Josh's point, the voters don't have this anxiety. The political parties obviously do, or many in the media do, but voters don't.
Voters don't. And I believe we've got Josh with us here, but he also did a video explaining why there's no such thing as a safe seat anymore. I'm wondering if we can tee that up so that we can throw to that video, which I think is a really good explanation of that research that the Australia Institute has been doing that really tracks, Josh, I guess, that phenomenon over recent elections, basically. Can we throw to that video now?
Think your vote doesn't matter in this election? Think again. Every election, we hear about safe and marginal seats, and voters in marginal seats are the only ones who ever seem to count. But the days of safe and marginal seats are over. At the last election, a third of voters gave their first preference to someone other than the major parties. 6 independents won in seats that the major parties considered safe. One of those electorates has since been abolished, but independent MPs in Mackellar, Wentworth, Goldstein, Kooyong and Curtin will all be looking for their second win at this election. As I pointed out in the conversation, defectors from the major parties have joined the ranks of the crossbench in the last couple of years. 4 of them are running in this election as independents, in the seats of Moore, Monash and Calare, and in the Queensland Senate race. Community independent candidates are running in 35 seats against Labor as well as the Coalition, in regional and in urban areas. There are second and third time candidates running in electorates like Bradfield, Cowper and Wannon, where a small swing would see them elected. All of this has changed the way that journalists talk about elections. Not so long ago, they wrote about a small handful of marginal seats, or even just one bellwether seat that could indicate the whole country's vote. We don't hear much about those kinds of seats anymore. These days, the media says there are 12, 25, or even 33 key seats. The ABC's election preview shows almost 50 key seats. The bottom line is this: there's no such thing as a safe seat anymore. And that's a good thing. On the 3rd of May, every vote in every seat will count.
Thanks so much for joining us this evening. That was our little explainer on why there's no such thing as a safe seat anymore. My colleague Josh Black has left us, and now my other colleague Frank Yuan has joined us. Frank is another one of our postdoctoral fellows at the Australia Institute. And Frank, during this election, we've seen a lot of international issues come to the fore. What are some of the key things that have stood out to you from this campaign?
Yeah, so most recently, it's of course the supposed threat of Chinese spies being thrown about, and finally, Foreign Minister Penny Wong has come out to talk about the issue, and as she always does, she treads a very careful line, and again says, China still doesn't trust Australia and so on. And it's now it's, I think, necessary to restate those facts, but it's also somewhat striking that some of the deeper questions in Australian foreign policy hasn't really been discussed that much in this election.
We have seen a couple of, as you say, I guess, scare campaigns. There was the Chinese research vessel that came. There's been other allegations. You were talking a little bit about, or I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about how either of the major parties have handled that. In particular, is there anything that Foreign Minister Penny Wong has talked about that you think has been crucial to this campaign?
Well, I mean, I might take a step back and start with those research vessels. Now, those come also on the back of the Chinese flotilla, as some would call it, a 3-ship group that circumnavigated Australia in February. And then there's the Chinese research vessel, which incidentally, there's been no evidence whatsoever of them actually up to some nefarious ends. From the government side, it's been very calm, and basically, and the government, various ministers have to their credit pointed out that what the Chinese ship, or previously the flotilla, the Navy group, was doing was within international laws. So that was to, I think, diffuse the or to preempt any of the fear-mongering that the opposition might like to engage in. And now, to many, I think, to many people's, especially those in the national security commentary space, to their disappointment, the messaging from the opposition hasn't been entirely disciplined. There has been a lot of suggestion that Australia has appeared weak. Australia's response to those have been inadequate, and some have pointed out actually the more you talk in those terms, the more Australia does come across as weak, as divided. So in that regard, I think some bipartisanship when it comes to message discipline has been somewhat lacking, certainly from the opposition side.
And do you think, on the whole, compared to the last election, do you think there's been more focus on these, I guess, tensions in the relationship with China, or scaremongering, more or less, this campaign compared to last election campaign?
There's been less, and that's somewhat surprising because when Dutton, of course, became the opposition leader, he had a track record of drumming up those fears. And to be sure, again, in February, there's been, again, as I said, those Chinese maritime ventures around Australia. They could have made it more of an issue in the campaign, but the timing simply perhaps wasn't opportune enough for them because those things happened so long ago relative to just the pace of the political events since. Yeah, but sorry, the other thing I might bring up is also just the on the other side of Australia's relations with great powers, with America, there's absolute bipartisanship, or the appearance of it, when it comes to AUKUS and the broader Australia's alliance with the US, and that, I think, is a policy area where bipartisanship hasn't served Australia particularly well, and indeed the arguably outdated notions of security have still not just lingered on, but if anything, even more entrenched. And as our colleague Emma Shortis has written in her Vantage Point essay, it's really striking that in the past 3 years, and even longer, from the major parties, there really hasn't been much discussion or any sign of rethinking on that front.
Have either of the major parties really tried to target voters from the Chinese Australian community at this election?
I can't see many signs from that, but I do recall back in 2023, if not slightly even earlier, Dutton actually started talking the language of being perhaps the better manager of relationship with China. And at one point, I think he floated expanding Australia's trade export to China by 100%, so doubling trade. Now that's wildly optimistic, perhaps, but it was very interesting in that period to see the direction of travel and then to see the coalition step back significantly from that.
And I'm not sure if you've seen this, but I had heard, I haven't seen it myself, did Foreign Minister Penny Wong record anything specifically that was trying to hose down, I guess, some of those issues, I guess, that we've seen with a bit of the scaremongering around Chinese vessels and other things that have happened during the course of the campaign?
Right. So I think it was, if I recall, Defence Minister Richard Marles fronted that messaging campaign more, and I suspect the rationale was to have the Defence Minister using that position and lending more credence to that message. But yeah, I think Minister Wong has been, again, just consistently disciplined in her messaging. But yeah, in terms of so I think it's important to note that the way they tried to diffuse the tension there was to put forward a legalistic almost argument that what China was doing was entirely within international law, and that even though we regret some of the specific choices of timing or the lack of communication they had,
trying to put it into a bigger context.
That's right. Yeah. Even though again, I think they failed to, or perhaps they never wanted to, I think point out the obvious, which was that those 3 ships could have posed no threat to Australian national security. Australia had and still has and will increasingly improve actually as current defence plan goes, its capability to defend itself against those small contingent of ships. And it's hard to imagine China sending a substantial part of their fleet this way in any situation because the priority will be much closer at home.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you.
That's right.
Richard, we're going to be wrapping up very shortly, and I think we're starting to see some of those numbers come through from polling booths across the country. We've touched a little bit, I guess, on the issue of hung parliaments and, which is one of the things that we might see as an outcome of tonight's result. We've talked a little bit about Peter Dutton and the coalition kind of really having what I think most commentators would agree a very poor campaign that hasn't done very well with the public, but one shining light in taxing the gas export industry that seems to have been the most popular policy that they've put forward this campaign. And cost of living, I guess, is the other big issue. We saw a budget coming in just before this election started, and we have seen a number of different policies really aimed at helping people who are struggling to make ends meet. Do you think that will be, I guess, the central issue that comes out of this election?
Oh, I do. And I think, it'd be fascinating to hear from Amy. She's just gone and had a quick look at the early numbers. I saw some pretty grim-looking numbers there for Peter Dutton in Dixon.
Look, I can tell you there's been a 3% swing statewide in Queensland to Labor so far, which, I remember looking at the last election around this time and Peter Dutton was on track to lose his seat. If this swing continues, Peter Dutton could lose his seat. Petrie is not looking so great for the coalition right now, which used to be a bellwether, used to be where the nation went for Petrie. That is also not looking good, and it's above what you would usually expect to see at this particular point. So exceptionally early, but there is a swing on in Queensland in these early booths. which has Labor kind of cheering, and the coalition have just gone a little bit silent in some of my chats. So they're not feeling very confident right now.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll all find out pretty soon how Australians really feel. We may or may not know all of the results tonight, but certainly the early results aren't suggesting the Libs are having a good election.
No.
Strangely, the bookmakers and everyone else probably got it right in the end. So yeah, look, I just we'll wrap up soon, but I'd love to hear a bit more from Amy about what she thinks is going on.
Yeah, I think we have seen a little bit of, it seems very early on, a late surge to Labor. I mean, there are questions over how well the Greens are going to perform now, and somebody raised before that, you know, there's questions potentially about will Adam Bandt hold on to Melbourne, which would be just an extraordinary result. And I'm not saying it will happen, but there is a little bit of like, oh no, this is not actually going as we thought it would. Whereas Labor is just kind of thinking, oh, maybe things are going a little bit better than we thought we would. I mean, I heard you ask Frank. Penny Wong did make a direct appeal to Chinese Australian voters. She spoke in Mandarin, and she basically just said that they still don't trust us. They're still calling you Chinese spies. That says everything you need to know about the Liberal Party. We know that that's having an impact in Bennelong and Chisholm, which were two seats that the Liberals thought that they might be able to actually, you know, pull back on. They're not actually seeing that. The Indian community is apparently also showing a bit of a backlash against the coalition because of the defence spending, because of some of the xenophobic comments that came out, and also weirdly because they decided that they were going to reappoint Mike Bozzullo in any government that they led. So there is, it seems, a lot of micro campaigns that are going on that may have seen people in these last couple of weeks start to swing even harder to Labor, but we've got a lot of count left to go. So if things are still fairly early on, do we have any sense of, you just mentioned Adam Bandt, and it might be still way too early there, but how are the Greens going overall? Does it look like there's been a swing to or against? Do we have that? It's probably a little bit too early. I mean, the Greens, campaigners that I've been speaking to have saying that the booths look good for them, and they think that, you know, in the early votes that they might have done quite well.
Sorry, I've just heard there's a massive swing to Greens in Richmond.
There we go. Yeah, Richmond was one of the seats actually that popped up during the week that the Greens could potentially win. So Richmond and Wills. So Victoria probably playing better for them than Queensland. And Adam Bandt, he's just speaking on ABC Now, and he's basically just saying that he's feeling quite comfortable. I think that there's some people who are on coalition and Labor counts kind of looking at it and just thinking, oh, maybe not in where we are, which would be Queensland. I mean, Queensland is probably the Greens' weakest state right now. But I think that this election has basically been a story of people going, we're going to give one last chance, we're going to grit our teeth and give one last chance to the least worst option, but we want some safeguards in there. We want to see a big crossbench. We want to see independents and minor parties like the Greens basically hold power to account. And we saw the Greens pivot to that very quickly in their entire campaign, which effectively became keep Dutton out and vote us in to hold the Labor to account. That was their entire message. And that has proven quite popular, I think, in some of the inner city seats in Melbourne in particular.
And look, if Labor win a majority government tonight, then, you know, for those people interested in climate, for those people interested in progressive policy, great. Because, you know, there's going to, regardless of the lower house result, the balance of power in the Senate is going to be held by the Greens, maybe shared with some independents, but there's going to be a supermajority of parliamentarians elected tonight. This is clear from the early numbers. There's going to be a supermajority of parliamentarians elected who want more ambitious, or they say they want more ambitious policy change on climate. The real question going forward is going to be, is Labor going to work with the Greens, work with the independents to actually get shit done? Or is he going to continue to say, as he often said in this term, well, until we can get the Libs on board, even though we've got a supermajority in Parliament, we can't do this. Now, we know Labor's willing to work with the Greens to pass industrial relations laws. We know Labor's willing to work with the Greens on some things. Whether they're willing to work on climate, whether they're willing to work on accountability, time will tell. But, you know, wrapping up early by design tonight, there'll be plenty of people with plenty of Anthony Green type computers making all sorts of projections, but looks like Amy might have some new numbers.
I was just saying, no, not new numbers, but Leichhardt is looking very good for Matt Smith, the Labor candidate there. Labor have got quiet little celebrations going on right now. And at the moment in Aston, Labor is still ahead, and they did not intend on being ahead. They basically had given up in that one. And the Nationals are already talking about who will be the next leader. So they're behind in Bendigo. They're not doing so good in Cowper, not doing great in Calare. There's going to be, I think, a lot of questions for David Littleproud, who has been looking quite ruddy in the coverage, I would have to say. And Barnaby Joyce has kept his mouth shut during the campaign and in response to some of David Littleproud's messages that he's been giving out tonight. So that'll be a very interesting one to watch too. How do the Nationals regroup?
So I think we'll wrap it up very shortly. But Richard, whatever the outcomes tonight, and we'll see that over the course of this evening, perhaps tomorrow and the coming days as well. You know, democracy thrives on high expectations is one of your favourite sayings.
Yep.
What would be your ambitions for the next Parliament? What would you hope that they prioritise to tackle?
Oh, I hope they actually, if regardless of the composition of the lower house, whether it's a majority Labor government or a minority Labor government, across the Parliament, I hope that those candidates who've run for office saying they're serious about reducing inequality, they're serious about doing something about housing, and serious about listening to science on climate change, I just hope they're actually willing to work together. Not in a kumbaya, we all agree with each other version of work together, but in a constructive, to get votes, to get legislation through the Parliament requires it to pass through both houses. And I hope that a Labor minority or a Labor majority government works with people who can actually get good progressive legislation through, because while we talk about majority as if, well, if you win the government, you win the election, you get to do what you want for 3 years, that's not it at all. Whether Labor continues to say, well, until the Liberals support Labor policy, we can't have Labor policy. John Howard never said that. This is a new idea, you know. So I'm really hopeful that our Parliament operates the way that it was designed to, which is for a majority of parliamentarians to figure out what they jointly want and go out there and do it.
So thanks so much for joining us this evening. This has been the Australia Institute's Election Night Live coverage. We appreciate you joining us. You can find all of our research and explainers at australiainstitute.org.au. Don't forget, Amy's running the live blog as well. You can always sign up for our newsletter and to receive SMS alerts, because once Parliament goes back, the live blog will continue on parliamentary sitting days. Is that right, Amy?
Yep, every parliamentary sitting day, budget sittings, estimates, you'll find me.
All the
having
excitement.
An existential crisis.
But thank you again for joining us this evening. We'll let you head over to the places that have more.
Oh God, it looks like Tim Wilson
up-to-date
got
counts.
A chance in Goldstein.
Oh no!
Here we go. All the excitement is happening. Strap in, and yeah, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We really appreciate you coming along for this, our very first live election night coverage. We hope to provide you with a bit more expert analysis and to go to some of the real policy issues that we've seen aired during this campaign. And we'll see you again soon. Thanks so much for joining us. Good night.
Everyone. Thanks, Eb.
Yeah, thank you, Ebony.
I think it's really important to have a think tank, a group, looking at the overarching principles